This is People Are the Worst, the show where leadership meets reality. Because navigating people and people problems isn't just part of the job, it is the job. Join us as we tackle the messy, the maddening, and the downright ridiculous and explore how to lead through it all with clarity, courage, and maybe some caffeine. I'm Lindsey.
And I'm Lucy, and today we are continuing to explore the rise of leadership intelligence and the 5 core skills needed to develop leadership intelligence. In the last episode, we talked about the 3rd skill that helps leaders develop leadership intelligence, and that is being curious and asking great quality questions. If you missed that episode, we highly recommend going back and listening or watching at your convenience. Now, let's discuss the next skill up for today. That's skill 4. And we believe that it really improves our leadership intelligence, and that's making decisions at high velocity. This episode is part 1 of a 2-part series on this topic because there is just so much to unpack here. Now, in fast-moving environments, leaders rarely have perfect information or unlimited time to make important decisions. And high-velocity decision-making is about finding that balance between thoughtful input and forward momentum so that progress doesn't stall. And we can all really relate to this. And most complex decisions come down to 3 things. It's the data that you have, the stakeholders that are involved, and the process that you decide to use. Now, the goal here is not a perfect certainty. It's going to be gathering enough perspective and information to make a sound call and keep moving forward. Great leaders know how to involve the right people, use the right amount of information, and choose a decision process that matches that moment.
And the reason this skill matters so much right now is the pace of change has accelerated dramatically, as we all feel and are familiar with. New technologies like AR are reshaping how work gets done. Markets are shifting faster than many organizations are used to, and leaders are constantly facing decisions where the rules are still being written. In environments like this, waiting for perfect clarity, it isn't an option. Leaders need to get comfortable making thoughtful decisions with incomplete information, learning quickly and adjusting as they go. The uncomfortable truth about leadership today is this: if you're waiting for perfect information, you're already too late. High-velocity decision-making isn't about rushing. Speed in leadership isn't about moving faster. It's about removing the friction that slows decisions down. It's about creating enough clarity to move forward, bringing the right voices into the conversation, and helping teams keep momentum even when the environment around them is changing. In this episode, we're going to answer some questions and unpack how leaders can make decisions at high velocity while still bringing the right people, data, and perspectives into the process. Let's get into the first question. So Alex asked us, I have a team of 8 direct reports, and I'm really struggling to prioritize my time. And I feel like a lot of this is to do with how I'm thinking about making decisions. I have so much to do, and I'm finding it hard to decide where I have the highest impact and which pieces to delegate. How should I think about navigating this, and how I make decisions quickly so the team can move forward without being blocked by me?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Luce?
Well, we've all succumbed to being the blocker of good forwards momentum at some point, for sure. I know I'm certainly in that camp a lot of the time. And so it sounds like what Alex is really asking is around, like, is this delegation piece particularly, like, it's really hard to know where you are, how to prioritize your time and where to spend that high impact time, the time that you have on those high impact pieces, when it's unclear how to make decisions around delegation and that kind of thing. And prioritization is fundamentally decision making about where time and effort should go. If everything feels important, it usually means that no one has actually made a decision about what matters the most. And this is another key component piece around clarity that you'll see as a kind of thread through what we speak about. It's really hard to unblock people. It's really hard to move forwards with speed if it's not clear. Priorities aren't clear, decision-making processes aren't clear, expectations aren't clear. So the first thing that we need to do when we're faced with a decision is to decide whether to make it. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but the way that we do that is asking, is now the right time? That's the first thing. Is this the right scope? And am I the right person to be making this decision? So let's unpack briefly, like each one of those things. So is now the right time for a decision to be made? And sometimes everything feels urgent at the moment, especially with AI. Everything feels like it's a moment in time. A decision's got to be made now. I don't have all the information to do it. Do I need to tackle this decision today? Or should I hold off until I have more buy-in or more information or whatever else it is that I need? And part of being a leader is making decisions with imperfect information. And we've heard this a lot. And we'll go into that sort of that imperfect information data piece in part 2 of this. And another part is really recognizing that the right thing at the wrong time is often the wrong thing. So I think timing is really, really important. So is now the right time? The next is this the right scope? And scope is really important because when faced with a complex decision, we want to see if we can break it down into a series of smaller ones. Like if you imagine kind of nodes on a tree, if you're considering a new hire, can you set up a work trial for that just to make that a bit smaller? If you're considering a partnership, can you run like a pilot project? We're just trying to lessen the load of the size of the scope of some of these things that we're being asked to do at the moment. And one way you can think about scope is in terms of a door. And I find this analogy really helpful. Like how easy or painful is it to come back through that door once you've gone through it? And we call this decision reversibility. So the harder it is to reverse a decision, the more you'll want to think about how to break down its scope so that you have a little bit more data up front with which to work with.
I love that so much. Sorry. It takes the pressure off it, right? It's like a great question to be like, okay, do I need to really have a lot of angst around this? Or at the end of the day, is this really reversible? And so, you know what? Like, let's just go for it and we'll learn and we'll iterate as we do.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that gives you the ability to iterate. Because I think at the moment, like we often don't have all the information we need. A lot of the time we're all navigating this new world for the first time. And so having that decision reversibility is going to be kind of important if we need to switch tack. Mm-hmm. And finally, am I the right person? And this is where the delegation piece comes in. Am I the right person to make this decision? Or should it actually be somebody else that's making this decision? And sometimes as leaders, we feel this decision paralysis, like it's our job to make all these like minutiae, small decisions on a daily basis. And the way to do this is by assessing how consequential a decision is in the context of your goals and responsibilities. If it's not directly consequential to you, it might need to go to a cross-functional colleague. If it's too in the weeds, it maybe needs to be passed to a direct report. For example, if I take it out of like potentially the realm that a lot of our listeners are in, it's a chef's responsibility to create a delicious meal. So the menu decisions are on the chef. But which knife to use to cut up the carrots? Well, that's fully in the domain of the prep cook. And this ownership question is especially important to double check that you've changed the scope in the last step. So that scope piece is going to be really important when you're looking at the ownership piece. And there may be some pieces that you can delegate a little bit further down the line. So to summarize, the first step in making a good decision is whether to make it in the first place. Is now the right time? Number 1, is this the right scope? Number 2, and number 3, are you the right person? And if the answer to all of these is yes, then you're ready to do the actual deciding.
Yeah, I love that. I also think one thing to add is I think it's important that Alex really reflect on where can he have the highest impact? Like, where is his zone of genius? And often, sometimes, only you can answer that or you can get feedback from others. But I think that's just an important thing to take into consideration when you're thinking about, okay, what is mine to do and what is not mine to do is really understanding what you're really good at and what you should do, right? And also then thinking about your direct reports and like, what are they uniquely good at? What is their zone of genius? And that overlay can be quite helpful as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of where good career conversations come in, I think, as well, to understand, like, so you really know your direct reports and what their zones of genius are too.
Yeah, because when you're in your zone of genius, not only do you do great work, but you also are energized by it. And so it has that, it has that double impact, if you will, or it's a great place to be. And so no shame in being there, right?
Right. And you could often make decisions faster if you're in your zone of genius, because you have a lot more context and pattern matching than others would as well.
Absolutely. Yep. Love it.
All right. On to question 2. So Jordan asks, this is a nice short one. How do I know, although I'm sure your answer will be lengthy, how do I know whether or not my strategic thinking is effective when everything is moving so quickly? And I can kind of see Jordan's point here around how he's kind of like linking, decision making to strategic thinking, which is so important when you're trying to move fast.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's like, I'm almost like kudos to you for even like stepping back and asking, am I thinking strategically right now? Because I think when there's so much urgency right now, it's very easy to just get stuck in a reactive mode. So, I think first of all is really like, how are you defining strategic thinking? So whether, before you evaluate, right, is my strategic thinking effective? Let's like baseline definition. What is strategic thinking? And sometimes you'll make a strategic bet, which won't pay off. And sometimes it'll be incredibly high impact. But at the end of the day, strategic thinking isn't about always being right. It's about lifting your head up out of your day to day and taking your whole environment into account. And I can't emphasize this enough. I think this comes into play more than ever right now because everyone feels like they're behind. It is a race right now. And when you feel like you're behind, you really tend to operate from a reactive position. And you can lose sight of being strategic very easily. Mm-hmm. And so here's a good way to check, to ask yourself, like, am I being strategic right now? So here's a way to think, like, am I doing these things? And these things are. So behavior number 1 is really understanding your company's strategy and goals. And how does that change now with AI, right? So that's behavior number 1. Behavior number 2 then is educating yourself on the industry and the market your company is in. And I think, again, right now, you've got to look at a lens and say, well, how is my industry impacted by AI? What's going to change? What's not going to change? Does it have a moat or not? And then behavior number 3 is really carving out enough time. And I think this is where, when you already feel like you're behind, it's very hard to do this, but it's very important, is carving out enough time to actually think big picture and to step out. And so, because if we don't do this and we just stay in a reactive mode, we can end up just sort of operating these ruts and they don't take in the new context. And so, for example, let's say you're hiring, your team might be expanding, your hiring strategy might need to look really different right now because of AI, right? How are you even if you're hiring a similar role, then how are you evaluating their AI fluency right now, right? So just again, you got to make time to actually step back and think about the big picture. And behavior number 4 is set strategic priorities and align your team around them. So when things are moving so quickly, it is that much more important that you communicate what your strategic priorities are, because people need the context in which to make their own decisions quickly. And as we've seen and will continue to see, as orgs are flattening and more people are having more direct reports, right? Many people don't have that time to kind of check in with each person. And so it's just so important to communicate what your strategic priorities are. They might change, right? But communicate, make sure people understand why they are the way they are right now so that they have that context to make decisions in and can make decisions quickly. I think lastly, once you've gone through these behaviors, right, I think it's very beneficial right now because there's so much change. It's just check your thinking. So asking your manager, right, here's what I'm noticing right now. Like, here's how I'm thinking strategically about the business, but what am I missing? And this has 2 effects, right? One, of course, is like, alignment, right? Like, are you thinking? Because the last thing you want to do is communicate to your team, your strategic priorities if they aren't aligned, right, with the company at large. And then further, you're also making your strategic thinking visible. The fact that like you are creating the time and space to be able to make sure that you're thinking strategically and then communicating that right up and down. So I think those are the key things is like, one, hats off to you for even reminding yourself to think strategically. I think you really have to be intentional about that right now, especially when everyone feels like they're behind. And those are the 4 behaviors that we just went through. And then alignment, like it's always helpful to just check in and see sort of if you're strategic, the way you're thinking strategically maps to the way your manager or maybe some of your cross-functional leaders are thinking as well.
Yeah. And to to Jordan's point about like, well, how do I know whether or not my strategic thinking is effective? Well, your strategic thinking is effective when you know what you're going to do to execute on it, because it's all very well thinking strategically, but you have to be acting strategically as well and have like a go forward plan. And I think a big telltale of when when your strategic thinking is ineffective is if it doesn't lead you to a clear path forwards, which at the moment is going to be your team's undoing. So, kind of like behavior 1, understand your company strategy and goals. Behavior 2, educate yourself on the industry and market. Behavior 3, carve out enough time to think big picture. And behavior 4, set strategic priorities and align your team around them. So like that behavior 4 is really the culmination of behavior 1, 2, and 3 to really be able to like actually action that thinking for your team.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, that's really the pressure test, right? Like, are there actions I can take that link back to this strategy?
Yeah.
And therefore, yes, I'm actually acting strategically. Yeah. Great point. Yep. Wonderful. Okay. So we also have a question in from Taylor. So Taylor asks, this is a great question. When is performance management no longer effective? For instance, when do you make the decision to give up on an employee who's not making their goals? When do you just make the call?
Yeah, seems to have, I know we kind of say this every podcast because every time we have a question, it harps back to a coaching session that one of us has had, where it's come up and it came up last week. In fact, this exact question for me in a session. And it's a really big one because decision making, people often forget. They sort of think of the day-to-day decision making, but part of day-to-day decision making is deciding whether or not the people on your team are the right people on your team. And sometimes you will get to the point where you've done what you can and performance management isn't effective anymore. And it's always that trade-off between, do I have time to invest in this person's professional development to get them up to speed or to get them up to the level that they need to be, or not? And so you want to feel like you've done everything you can, but it can't be at the cost of all of your time taken off high impact things. And so I do think it's always a really, really tricky one to navigate. To get kind of more tactical, because that's our general MO here, I'd say the first thing to do is to recognize that performance management is itself a decision-making process, right? It's not just a series of conversations that you're having day to day with your team. And leaders often stay in it too long because they're hoping that the situation will resolve itself. But as we all know, hope is not a good strategy. Some of you may have heard Lindsey say that before. And one of the hardest leadership decisions is realizing the situation isn't improving. It's just repeating. And a helpful starting question is the person improving, or are we just repeating the same feedback conversation over and over again? And if you're seeing real progress, even if it's slow, that can sometimes, often, if you do have the time, be a good sign to keep investing in that person. The cost of going through the hiring process again and blah, blah, blah is often, so high that you want to kind of keep making improvements with the person. But if the pattern of feedback is like feedback, agreement from them, short improvement you witness, regression again, well, that's often a signal that there's something deeper that's going on. And it might be a skill that they don't have. It might be motivation that they don't have, or just simply a mismatch to the role or to the company, even to the values of the business. And that feedback piece is really important, because I think often we decide to give people feedback and we give it on the behaviors that we're witnessing. And we forget that those are surface level symptoms. And it's often we think we may have said this in a previous podcast around feedback. It's getting underneath the layers to look at the root of the problem of their performance issues. And those roots are going to be motivation. They're going to be competing commitments they have. They're going to be a sense of self that they're not living up to. There's going to be a lack of skill that they're not fully embracing or owning up to. And so you want to make sure that you're giving feedback about the underlying issue and not just the surface symptoms themselves. And that's like a big part of deciding whether or not that person is the right person for the job, to making sure that you've had the conversation about the right thing. Another lens, I think, to this question, from Taylor, I forgot their name for a second, had to scroll up to see, from Taylor, is another lens is the impact on the team that person is having. And sometimes someone can be really great in their role, but just a horrible culture add to the team, or toxic in some way, but you sort of keep them around for too long. But when someone consistently misses expectations, leaders sometimes focus only on helping that person, but they also need to consider fairness and morale of the rest of the team and the broader situation in which that underperforming person is sitting right now, and the impact of that on the rest of the team. There is nothing more demotivating to your direct reports than witnessing you tolerate a bad one, or one that's not performing, I should say. And so that's definitely one to keep in mind.
For sure. I just, to add to that, I remember a coaching session is a little while back now, but I think it can often, leaders can fall into a bit of a rut where they think about this decision in the context of them and this person. So them in terms of their own time, like, oh man, but rehiring is so hard and I don't have time to find someone and all of that, right? And then also like, well, I feel really badly. I don't know if I've given them enough feedback. Have they gotten a chance? They seem to be getting better, right? And not, I think the question to ask yourself, right? Or to ask a peer if they're in the situation, right? It's like, well, what is the impact to the team? And I think that often can be far bigger than the impact between you and the individual that you're thinking of, that you're performance managing, right? Because I just, as you said, like there is no better way to demotivate one of your top performers than to tolerate underperformance.
Yeah, it's a good short punchy soundbite, that one, just to remember, because it's like sits in the back of your mind. Yeah. You're kind of like, okay, I definitely don't want that for my high performers.
Right. Yeah.
I also think that when it comes to deciding whether or not it's time to make a change of personnel on your team, that sort of high velocity decision making here means not letting uncertainty drag on indefinitely. I'll see next month if it improves. We'll kind of have this feedback conversation and see if things get a little bit better. But actually, leaders need to set really clear milestones. If we see X improvement by Y date, we will continue. And if not, we will make the hard decision. And so I think having some good guardrails in place, having some milestones in the sand for yourself can be really helpful. And sometimes having those milestones shared with the individual too is also the right call. And that's more of a judgment call, I think, on that.
Yep.
And I think, that decision, sometimes a decision doesn't always mean termination. Sometimes the right decision is changing the role, finding them somewhere else to be in the organization, resetting expectations, or moving someone to work that's a better fit for their strengths. And expectations is huge. Most disappointments, this, Julie Zhu says this in Making of a Manager, most, disappointments on a team is the inability to set expectations clearly. I'm maybe paraphrasing ever so slightly, but it's something around that, where like sometimes it's you, sorry, as a manager, like you haven't set super clear expectations. And we've talked about that too, in previous episodes. But ultimately, the goal is clarity, right? When leaders delay decisions for too long, everybody feels it and everybody feels unclear about the direction of the team and where it's going.
Yes. Yes. Very true.
All right. So that's we should do one on performance management in general. I think that's probably a great future episode to talk about. But let's move on to our fourth question. And Morgan asks here, okay, so they say, my team has got a mandate to build and leverage agents to get our work done. AI agents, I think she means here, of course,
yes.
Which is different from the original things that we were responsible for. And none of us, including myself, have had previous experience doing this. What decisions do we need to make? Hard one.
Yes, you are not alone. So I think, as always, I think the key here is just get alignment to the extent you can and seek to understand. So in this context, what that looks like, right? It's just, if there is clarity to be gotten, go get it. And clarity could look like, so that you've got this mandate, right? You're not alone. Who doesn't have this mandate right now, right? But just getting clear on what does success look like? Like, what is leadership expecting? How would the mandate be measured, particularly in your scope, right? Like, what does success look like? Like, what's the why? What's the outcome we're trying to drive to? How do I know when I'm there? So I think just as clear as you can get, the better off you'll be, right? And then I think you really also need to think about, and for some teams, this is more obvious than others, but it's also then think about, like, once you I think your job as the leader is to get clarity from leadership, right? What does success look like? And I think you also have to be mindful about motivating your team. Like, what is in it for them? As a result, can they work on more strategic work, right? Like, and I think that also comes into like what's behind this, right? So really thinking about how do I translate what I just got into how do I really rally the team around this and what is in it for them? And then if no one has expertise, that's okay. Like that's kind of that can be a great place to be when you're working with a team, because you get to figure it out together and you can create this sense of belonging and community, and you can frame it as a challenge and like that you're working on together. And so that's okay that no one has the answers. I think some tips generally in doing that then is to start pretty discreet, right? Like pick that single task, like pick one thing you want to build and maybe even divide up into teams and all do it, get like smaller teams so it's easier to work in, and then I'll present what did you learn. And I think one of the things here, which is really interesting that's at play right now, is that there's so much pressure to move fast right now and everyone feels like they're behind. And yet also a lot of this is just, you've got to be willing to play and try and iterate, and like you're all doing something new. And so you've got to create a level of enough psychological safety in all of this where people feel safe to play and experiment and be curious and learn and share. And that can be a hard line to walk. And so again, I think it's great to get like, what does success look like? How do I motivate my team? And then see this as an opportunity to build that sense of community, and then just make it small enough so you can feel like you're making progress, right? And can celebrate, and also if you make the task small enough, or like you're building an agent to do X, not X, Y, and Z, right? Then I think it's just easier to also share information. Because it's just the canvas you're working on is small enough that you can, there are just like a lot of learnings and it's easier to share. And then lastly, making sure that you're like syncing back to leadership on what you're doing and how it's going and what you've accomplished, right? To keep that alignment, right? Like maybe it's shifted. Also, I'm sure you've learned things. And so report that back so that can be spread across other teams in the org. And also just again, like, just visibility, right? Two-way visibility. So those are my recommendations, and you are not alone. We are all doing this right now.
Yeah, I love the alignment one. It always comes down to that number one, getting clear getting clear yourself and then making it clear for everybody else. And getting clear yourself is like 50% of the job, I think, when it comes to this kind of thing, because you get asked questions and people come back to you and want to know your thoughts on things, and they sort of expect you to have all the answers, and you feel the pressure to have all the answers. And so, getting as much information as you can before we start is going to help you out.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, we have another question in from Casey. So Casey states, I'm a manager, but also I have substantial IC responsibilities, so individual contributor responsibilities. And I'm struggling a bit to manage my time when I need to context switch between them. How do I decide to spend my time when there are so many demands on it?
This is kind of similar to Alex's question above about thinking about how to delegate and how to prioritize a bit more. And I think, there's now more than ever a push for managers to also be strong ICs. It's, there aren't as many roles now, especially in technology companies for managers just to purely manage and not to be doing at the same time. And then it just becomes very hard. It's very common in smaller teams or fast growing companies where leaders are both kind of doing and leading simultaneously. So I think the first step is to recognize that these are two different jobs. And the moment you become a manager, your highest value work shifts from doing the work to deciding what work really matters for yourself and for your team. Individual contributor work tends to reward speed and focus, while, management work requires thinking about people and priorities and the bigger picture. So a mistake I think leaders make is treating management like something they do in the margins after the real work is done. And if leadership only happens after you finish your real work, then leadership will always be the thing that gets neglected. And we see that a lot. There's, you're interacting with your team day to day, you're on calls, you're doing the kind of, you're doing a lot of IC work as well. And then that thinking time, that strategic thinking time, that ability to really, be directive and set clear expectations and that good stuff is set to the margins. And I think high velocity decision making here often means being very intentional about what only you can do, which is what Lindsey was referring to when we talked about Alex earlier on in question 1. And to ask yourself, what decisions, relationships, or guidance actually require me and me alone. And then also look at where, and then in order to be able to free up time for that, you've got to look at where you might be holding on to work that could be delegated or could be simplified or could be deferred. Is now the right time? Am I the right person? Is this the right scope? And leaders often stay too deep in IC work because they're comfortable there. And we see that a lot in that transition from IC to manager, right? You've got rewarded, you get a lot of praise, you've got a promotion, in fact, from being a great IC. So it feels comfortable, you're good at it, you kind of want to stick there. And it's a very common kind of failure mode of new managers in particular. We see it also a lot with really technical folks where they just love building. And then it's really hard not to build and to step back and do more of the management, which is, seen as like the boring part of my job is managing this team of people when I want to just be building the features, building the product.
Yep.
So I think just practically creating blocks of time where you can operate in one mode or the other, mornings for deep work, afternoons for people or leadership, whatever way around you want that to look like, can be helpful. I would slightly guard against having all your one-on-ones on one day. I think it's kind of exhausting, and everyone who gets your time in the afternoon does not get you at your best. So just being a little bit more thoughtful about that, but where you can segment up blocks of time so that the context switching isn't quite so rapid the whole time, can be really helpful, because that is what trips people up. And as Casey says, I struggle to manage my time when I need to context switch so much between them. And finally, just being very transparent with your team, let them know when you're available for different types of questions. And that kind of will help reduce this sort of constant context switching. And I think also just being transparent and vulnerable about finding the context switching tough.
Mm-hmm.
And, when they just come to you at all times, it's really difficult to be able to suddenly switch into a different mode and help them out with what they want. So them having in the back of their mind that you're finding that difficult at the moment can also be helpful. And, hopefully over time, as the team grows, the leadership work usually becomes, the highest leverage part of the role. And so, just making sure that you're doing what works for you. You're using tactics that have worked for you in the past, that you're compartmentalizing those two different roles. You're being open and transparent with your team about what you're finding tough and why you're segmenting out your time more.
Yep. Yeah. Excellent. I also think that sometimes we forget about with leadership, because we think about sometimes leadership and management as sort of the interaction with people, right? Like a one-on-one, or I don't know, planning an agenda for a team meeting. And I think that part of it is creating time to think strategically and step back. And have I been really clear about our strategic priorities, and am I being strategic, right? And so sometimes that actually leadership is IC work. And so being disciplined about recognizing that and being like, I need to actually create IC time to be the most effective leader I can. But the IC time is actually related to leadership.
Yeah.
Okay. So, sometimes even with the best frameworks and prep, we find ourselves lacking the confidence to actually make a decision, right? We second guess our ability to make the right choice, and we get stuck in indecision. Imposter syndrome is very common among leaders. Research from NerdWallet found that 78% of business leaders have experienced it. You are not alone. If you fall into that camp, just start by reminding yourself how you got to where you are. Recognize that you have the data and the competence to make this call. Ask yourself, how might a confident version of me respond to this situation? Or what would I tell a close friend or a colleague to do if they were making this decision? And remember, when in doubt, your intuition can help, as well as a mentor or a colleague who's been in your shoes. In part 2 of this decision-making series, we'll cover more frameworks for decision-making, how to think about data, and double-click on this piece around confidence. So, thank you so much for joining today. It was so fun. And if you want to pack what we've just discussed further, don't hesitate to reach out. We can connect on LinkedIn. You'll find our LinkedIns in the show notes. And you can learn more about how we support people leaders at elevateleadership.com, or feel free to email us. This just goes to Lucy and I. So if you want to share a question you have or something you're thinking about that you want to address in the show, obviously we always we change the names and everything, but you can email Lucy and I at dear, L&L at elevateleadership.com. So that's dear, L, the letter L, and L at elevateleadership.com. And we'll catch you next time on People Are the Worst.
Thanks so much. See you later.